The blood on her dress had already dried to a dark rust by the time Jane Dalton stumbled into the saloon in Great Bend, Kansas. Her left eye swollen shut, and her lips split open like overripe fruit. Every head turned toward her, conversations dying mid-sentence. But she knew what would happen next because it always did. They would look away, mind their own business, leave her to whatever fate had clearly found her on this sweltering August afternoon in 1876. Her husband's fists had done their work again, and not a soul in this town had ever lifted a finger to stop it. She made it 3 steps toward the bar before her knees buckled. The floor rushed up to meet her, and she braced for impact, but strong arms caught her before she hit the sawdust-covered planks. Through her good eye, she saw a face she didn't recognize, weathered and tanned, with startling green eyes beneath the brim of a dusty black hat. "Easy there, miss," the stranger said, his voice low and steady as he helped her find her footing. "You need a doctor." "I'm fine," Jane whispered automatically, because that's what she always said. That's what women like her were supposed to say. "You're bleeding." It wasn't a question. The cowboy, and he was clearly a cowboy from his worn leather chaps, and the gun belt slung low on his hips, guided her toward a chair. "Someone get Doc Morrison," he called out to the room. "Don't," Jane said, grabbing his sleeve with trembling fingers. "Please." "My husband, he'll be angry if I cause trouble." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Your husband did this." She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The truth was written all over her face in purple and blue. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. Probably at the livery or the general store." "Please, just let me rest a moment and I'll go home." "Home?" The cowboy knelt beside her chair so they were eye level. "Madam, I don't know you, but I know one thing for certain: you're not going back to any man who'd lay hands on you like this." Jane felt tears burning behind her eyes. In 3 years of marriage to Robert Dalton, not one person had ever said those words to her. Not her neighbors, not the shopkeepers, not even the preacher who'd married them. She'd screamed for help more times than she could count, and the whole town had simply closed their windows and turned up their lamps. "You don't understand," she said. "This is just how it is. He's my husband. I made vows. Those vows didn't include being someone's punching bag." The cowboy stood and turned to face the room. "Which one of you can tell me where Robert Dalton is?" The bartender, a portly man named Henderson, cleared his throat nervously. "Now, stranger, you don't want to go getting involved in domestic affairs. That's between a man and his wife." "Is that so?" The cowboy's hand rested casually on his gun belt, not threatening exactly, but making his point clear. "Seems to me that when a man beats a woman half to death, it becomes everyone's affair." "Look, mister," Henderson said, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. "We don't even know who you are. Name's Xavier Frost. I'm passing through on my way to Colorado, but I reckon my plans just changed." He looked back at Jane. "Where's the sheriff's office?" Jane almost laughed, bitter and broken. "Sheriff Thompson won't do anything. He and Robert play cards every Thursday. He says what happens between married folks isn't law business." Xavier's expression darkened. "Then I guess this is my business now." "Why?" Jane asked, genuinely confused. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He crouched down again, his green eyes serious and kind. "Because somebody should have fought for you a long time ago, and I aim to make up for lost time." Before Jane could respond, the saloon doors burst open and Robert Dalton strode in, his face already red with rage. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with mean little eyes that found Jane immediately. "There you are," he snarled. "I told you to have supper ready by 5. What the hell are you doing in the saloon?" Xavier stood slowly, positioning himself between Jane and her husband. "She's getting medical attention, which she needs because of you." Robert's eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't think much of men who hit women." "That's my wife. What I do with her is none of your concern." Robert tried to step around Xavier, reaching for Jane's arm. "Get up. We're going home." Xavier's hand shot out, gripping Robert's wrist hard enough to make the bigger man wince. "She's not going anywhere with you." "The hell she isn't." Robert swung with his free hand, but Xavier was faster. He ducked under the punch and delivered a sharp jab to Robert's gut that doubled him over. The saloon erupted in chaos, some men shouting for them to take it outside, others placing quick bets on who would win. "Stop," Jane cried, trying to stand. "Please, you'll only make it worse for me later." Xavier glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "There isn't going to be a later, not with him." Then he turned his attention back to Robert, who was recovering from the gut punch and looked ready to charge like an angry bull. "You want her. You're going to have to go through me first." Robert let out a roar and rushed forward. Xavier sidestepped at the last second, sending the larger man crashing into a table. Cards and poker chips scattered across the floor. Robert came up swinging, and this time his fist connected with Xavier's jaw, snapping his head to the side. But Xavier barely seemed to notice. He responded with a combination of punches that had Robert staggering backward. "Stay down," Xavier warned. "This doesn't have to continue." But Robert Dalton had never been smart about knowing when he was beaten. He pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Xavier with a wild slash. The blade caught Xavier's forearm, drawing blood, but Xavier caught Robert's wrist and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the floor, and Xavier followed up with an uppercut that lifted Robert off his feet and sent him crashing down unconscious. The saloon fell silent except for heavy breathing and Jane's quiet sobbing. Xavier rolled his shoulder, testing his injured arm, then walked back to Jane. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood seeping through his torn sleeve. "I've had worse." He extended his good hand to her. "Come on, let's get you to the doctor, both of us, I reckon. But Robert will wake up with a headache and hopefully some sense knocked into him. And if he comes near you again, he'll answer to me." Xavier's voice was firm but gentle. "I meant what I said. You've got someone fighting for you now." Jane took his hand, her fingers trembling against his calloused palm. "I don't understand why you're doing this. Maybe because it's the right thing to do. Maybe because I know what it's like to feel helpless and alone. Maybe because the moment I saw you walk through those doors, something in my chest told me I was supposed to be here today." He helped her to her feet. "Does there need to be a reason beyond that?" They walked out of the saloon together, leaving Robert groaning on the floor behind them. The late afternoon sun was brutal, and Jane squinted against the brightness. The whole town seemed to be watching them now, faces appearing in windows, people pausing mid-stride on the boardwalk. Doc Morrison's office was 3 buildings down. The doctor, an elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands, looked up from his desk when they entered. "Good Lord," he said, standing quickly. "Jane, what happened?" "Same thing that always happens," Xavier said before Jane could offer her usual excuses. "Her husband beat her. I need you to check her over, make sure nothing's broken, and I've got a knife wound that could use stitching." Doc Morrison's expression grew grim. "Sit down, both of you." He examined Jane first, his touch careful and professional. "2 cracked ribs, severe bruising, and that eye needs treating so infection doesn't set in. You're lucky, Jane. This could have been so much worse." "Lucky," Jane repeated hollowly. "She won't be going back to that house," Xavier said from where he sat waiting for his turn. "Can you think of somewhere safe she could stay?" "My sister runs a boarding house," Doc Morrison said. "She'd take Jane in, I'm certain of it." "No," Jane said suddenly, panic rising in her throat. "I can't. Robert will come looking for me. He'll make trouble for your sister. He'll make trouble for everyone. Then we'll deal with that trouble when it comes, Xavier said firmly, but you're not going back to him. I don't care if I have to stand guard at that boarding house myself. Doc Morrison finished bandaging Jane's ribs and moved to Xavier's arm. This is going to need about 8 stitches. You willing to get involved in this situation, son? Robert Dalton has friends in this town. Then they can all take their turn coming at me, Xavier said without hesitation. I'm not leaving her unprotected. Jane watched as the doctor cleaned and stitched Xavier's wound. He barely flinched, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on some point on the wall. She couldn't understand this man. In all her life, no one had ever stood up for her the way he had in the past hour. Her own father had sold her off to Robert for a breeding horse and $50. Her mother had told her to be a good wife and keep her mouth shut. The whole town had looked the other way every time she'd appeared with new bruises. But this stranger, this cowboy passing through on his way to somewhere else, had changed his plans for her, had fought for her, had gotten hurt for her. Why were you heading to Colorado? She asked quietly. Xavier glanced at her. I worked a ranch up in Wyoming for the past 5 years. Boss sold the place last month. I heard there was work in the silver mines around Leadville, so I figured I'd try my hand at something new. You were a ranch hand, wrangler mostly. I'm good with horses. He smiled slightly. Better with horses than people, truth be told. You seemed pretty good with people back in that saloon, Doc Morrison commented, tying off the last stitch. That wasn't about being good with people. That was about doing what needed doing. Xavier flexed his arm carefully. Thank you, Doc. What do I owe you? Nothing. Consider it payment for finally giving Robert Dalton what he's deserved for years. The doctor turned to Jane. I'm serious about my sister's boarding house. Let me send word to her. You can stay there tonight at least. Give yourself time to think about what comes next. Jane nodded slowly. What came next? She'd never thought beyond surviving each day. The idea that she could actually leave Robert, could start over somewhere, seemed impossible, but maybe with Xavier's help. She caught herself. Xavier had his own life, his own plans. He'd already done more than anyone could have expected. She couldn't ask him to give up his future for her. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier said, I'll stay in town a few days. Make sure you're settled and safe. You don't have to do that, Jane protested. You've done so much already. I'm not leaving until I'm sure you're protected. His tone left no room for argument. Get used to it from now on. Those words settled into Jane's chest like warm honey. Get used to it. As if having someone care about her welfare was going to be a regular occurrence. As if she deserved to be protected and defended. The concept was so foreign that she almost couldn't process it. Doc Morrison arranged for them to meet his sister, Margaret Winters, at the boarding house on 3rd Street. It was a respectable 2-story building with white shutters and a neat front garden. Margaret was a widow in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Robert Dalton should have been run out of town years ago, she said after Doc Morrison explained the situation. You're welcome here as long as you need, Jane. And you too, Mr. Frost, if you need a room. I appreciate that, madam, Xavier said. I'll take you up on that offer. Margaret showed Jane to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. There was a bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher of water, and a window that looked out over the street. Simple, but more peaceful than anywhere Jane had been in years. Rest now, Margaret said gently. I'll bring up some supper later. You're safe here. After Margaret left, Jane sank onto the bed and finally let herself cry. Not the silent tears she'd learned to shed so Robert wouldn't hear and get angry, but real, wrenching sobs that hurt her cracked ribs but released something inside her that had been locked away for too long. There was a soft knock on the door. "Jane, can I come in?" She wiped her eyes. "Yes." Xavier entered, carrying a tray with soup and bread. "Margaret was heading up, but I told her I'd bring this. Thought maybe you'd want to talk." "You don't have to keep taking care of me," Jane said, but she was grateful anyway. "I know I don't have to." He set the tray on the small table by the window. "But I want to. Is that all right?" Jane nodded. She picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a sip of the soup. It was warm and nourishing, and she realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow you rest. Let those ribs heal." Xavier leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "After that, whatever you want to happen. If you want to stay in Great Bend, we'll make sure Robert understands you're done with him. If you want to leave town, I'll help you get wherever you want to go." Just like that, just like that. "But why?" Jane set down the spoon, needing to understand. "You're a stranger. I'm nothing to you. Why would you turn your whole life upside down for someone you don't even know?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "My mother was married to a man like Robert. I was just a boy, maybe 8 years old. He'd beat her and she'd try to hide it, but I knew. I always knew. One night it got real bad. I tried to stop him, little as I was, and he threw me across the room. Broke my arm." Jane's breath caught. "My uncle found out what happened. He was a marshal, big and tough as they come. He rode into town and beat my stepfather bloody in the middle of the street. Then he took my mother and me away to live with him. She met another man eventually, a good man who treated her right. And I swore that if I ever saw someone in the same situation, I'd do what my uncle did. I'd fight for them." "I'm sorry that happened to you," Jane whispered. "Don't be sorry. It taught me what kind of man I wanted to be." Xavier met her eyes. "I meant what I said before. You've got someone fighting for you now, so get used to it." Jane felt something shift inside her, not just gratitude, though there was that. Something else. Something that made her aware of how strong Xavier's jaw was, how his green eyes seemed to see right through to her soul, how safe she felt with him nearby. "Thank you," she said inadequately. "I don't know how to repay you, don't need repayment. Just need you to believe you deserve better than what you've had." He pushed off from the wall. "I'll be right next door if you need anything. Get some rest." After he left, Jane finished her soup and changed into a nightgown that Margaret had provided. She climbed into bed, expecting to lie awake worrying about what Robert would do, but exhaustion claimed her quickly. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of raised voices outside. Heart pounding, she went to the window and looked down. Robert was standing in the street, shouting up at the boarding house. "Jane, get out here. You're my wife and you're coming home." Xavier appeared on the porch below, dressed but with his hair still mussed from sleep. "I told you yesterday. She's done with you." "This ain't your business, Drifter. See, that's where you're wrong. I'm making it my business." Xavier stepped down into the street. "And I'm giving you a choice. You can leave town or you can try me again. But either way, you're not getting anywhere near her." Robert had brought 3 friends with him, all rough-looking men who worked at the stockyards. They fanned out behind him, trying to look intimidating. 4 against 1, Robert said with a nasty smile. "Not such good odds for you now." Xavier didn't look concerned. "I've faced worse." Before anything could happen, Sheriff Thompson arrived on horseback, looking annoyed at being pulled from his breakfast. "What's all this commotion?" "This stranger is keeping my wife from me," Robert said. "I want him arrested." "Is Jane here of her own free will?" The sheriff asked Margaret, who had come out onto the porch. "She is," Margaret said firmly. "And she's got the bruises to show why she doesn't want to go home with that man." Sheriff Thompson sighed. He clearly didn't want to be involved, but too many people were watching now. "Robert, maybe it's best if I what? Let some drifter steal my wife." Robert shook his head. No, she's coming with me, and if this cowboy tries to stop me, you'll arrest him for assault. Actually, came a new voice, you'll find that Mr. Frost acted in defense of a woman being attacked. I witnessed the whole thing yesterday. Jane recognized the speaker, Benjamin Harper, a lawyer who kept an office above the general store. He was a serious man in his 40s, respected in town. Mr. Dalton, Harper continued, I've also witnessed your treatment of your wife on multiple occasions. If this matter goes before a judge, I'd be happy to testify to that fact, as would several others. Ben, come on, Robert said, his bluster fading. You know how women are. Jane just needs a firm hand sometimes. What I know, Harper said coldly, is that you're lucky Mr. Frost only gave you a beating yesterday. In some places, what you've done to Jane would get you hanged. Sheriff Thompson looked between everyone gathered, clearly calculating which side would cause him less trouble. Finally, he said, Robert, I suggest you go home. If Jane wants to leave you, that's her right. And if you go near her or this boarding house, I'll have to arrest you for disturbing the peace. It wasn't the justice Jane deserved, but it was more than she'd expected. Robert looked murderous, but with the sheriff and the lawyer both against him, he had no choice. He spat in the dirt and stalked away, his friends trailing behind him. Xavier watched until they were out of sight, then came back up to the porch. He looked at Harper. I appreciate you speaking up. Should have done it years ago, Harper admitted. We all should have. Jane, if you want to file for divorce, I'll handle the paperwork free of charge. With the witnesses willing to testify to abuse, I believe we can get you a legal separation. Jane appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl. Divorce. The word felt dangerous and thrilling all at once. It's possible, Harper said. Not easy, and it'll take time, but possible. Think it over. After Harper left, Jane sat on the porch with Xavier and Margaret. The morning was already heating up, promising another scorching summer day. He'll come back, Jane said quietly. Robert doesn't give up. He'll wait until you leave town, Xavier, and then he'll come for me. Then I won't leave town, Xavier said simply. But your job in Colorado, there are always jobs. You need protection more than I need a silver mine. He looked at her seriously. Unless you want me to go. If my being here makes things harder for you, I'll find another way to keep you safe. No, Jane said quickly, too quickly. She felt her cheeks warm. I mean, if you're willing to stay, I'd be grateful. I just don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden. Xavier's green eyes held hers. You're someone worth fighting for. Margaret smiled knowingly and excused herself to go start breakfast. Alone on the porch, Jane found herself acutely aware of Xavier sitting just a few feet away. He smelled like leather and soap, and despite the fight yesterday, he moved with an easy grace. Tell me about Wyoming, she said, wanting to know more about him. Not much to tell. I worked at the Rocking H Ranch for 5 years, broke horses, worked cattle drives, fixed fences, honest work. He stretched his long legs out in front of him. Boss's daughter took a shine to me, thought maybe we'd get married. But I didn't love her, and it seemed wrong to marry someone just for convenience. That's more principled than most men I've known, Jane said. What about you? How'd you end up married to Robert? Jane's expression darkened. My father owed him money. Robert said he'd forgive the debt if I'd marry him. I was 18 and didn't think I had a choice. My parents told me it was my duty to help the family. She laughed bitterly. Some duty. That's not a marriage, that's a sale. I know that now. Jane pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the heat. I used to think I'd done something wrong, that if I was a better wife, Robert wouldn't get so angry, but it was never about me, was it? No. It was about him being a coward who could only feel powerful by hurting someone smaller than him. Xavier leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You didn't deserve any of what he did to you. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Jane felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest, hope, maybe, or the beginning of trust. She'd known Xavier for less than a day, but he'd already proven himself more honorable than any man she'd ever met. Over the next week, a routine developed. Xavier took odd jobs around town, working at the livery, helping repair the church steeple, even doing some carpentry for the general store. He gave his earnings to Margaret for room and board and to Jane for her expenses. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch with Jane and they'd talk. She learned that Xavier was 25, that he'd been on his own since he was 16, that his favorite color was the blue of a clear winter sky. He learned that Jane was 21, that she'd wanted to be a school teacher before her marriage, that she could play the piano and loved to read, but Robert had sold her books for drinking money. "I'll get you new books," Xavier promised. "What do you like to read?" "Anything. Everything. I used to love poetry especially." The next day, he showed up with a volume of Walt Whitman's poems, purchased from the general store. Jane held the book like it was made of gold. "I can't accept this," she said, even as her fingers traced the cover lovingly. "It's a gift." "You don't have to accept or not accept. It's just yours." Xavier smiled. "Read me something." So Jane opened the book and read aloud, her voice growing stronger as she lost herself in the words. Xavier watched her face, the way it came alive with joy, and felt something tighten in his chest. He was falling for her. He'd known it might happen, but the speed and intensity still caught him off guard. Everything about Jane drew him, in her resilience, her kindness despite everything she'd suffered, the way she could find beauty in a simple poem. He wanted to give her the world, wanted to see her smile every day, wanted to be the man who made her feel safe and cherished. But he held back. It was too soon. She was still healing, still legally married, still figuring out who she was outside of being Robert's victim. The last thing she needed was another man trying to stake a claim on her. Jane, for her part, found herself thinking about Xavier more than she probably should. The way he moved, confident and sure. The way he listened when she talked, really listened. The way he'd put himself in harm's way for her without hesitation. She'd catch herself watching him as he worked, admiring the strength in his shoulders, the capable movements of his hands. She felt guilty for these thoughts. She was still married, even if it was a marriage she wanted to escape. And Xavier deserved someone whole, not someone as broken as her. But then he'd smile at her, and her heart would skip, and she'd think maybe someday, when she was free, when she'd healed. 2 weeks after that first day, Robert made his move. He waited until Xavier was at the far end of town, helping the blacksmith, and then he came to the boarding house with a bottle of whiskey in him and murder in his eyes. Margaret saw him coming and locked the front door, but Robert kicked it in. The sound brought Jane running from upstairs, and she froze when she saw her husband standing in the front hall. "You're coming home," Robert slurred. "Right now." "No," Jane said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm filing for divorce. It's over, Robert. The hell it is." He started toward the stairs, but Margaret stepped in front of him with a fireplace poker in her hands. "You'll have to go through me first," the older woman said. Robert backhanded her, and Margaret fell hard. Jane screamed and rushed down the stairs. She got between Robert and Margaret, her hands raised. "Stop. Please, Robert, just leave. I'll go with you, just don't hurt her anymore." "Too late for that." Robert grabbed Jane's hair and yanked her toward the broken door. Pain exploded through her scalp, but she managed to grab the doorframe, refusing to make it easy for him. "Help!" she screamed. "Someone help!" Robert punched her in the stomach, driving the air from her lungs. Her grip on the doorframe loosened. He was dragging her out into the street when a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go." Xavier was running up the street, his face a mask of fury. Robert saw him coming and pulled a gun from his belt, pressing it to Jane's temple. "Stay back," Robert warned. "She's my wife, and I'll kill her before I let you have her." Xavier stopped, his hands raised. "Don't do this, Robert. You kill her, you'll hang. Maybe, but she'll still be dead." Robert's breath reeked of whiskey and rage. "You cost me everything, my respect, my marriage. I'm going to take something from you now." Jane could feel the cold metal of the gun against her skin. This was it, she realized. This was how she was going to die. She'd survived 3 years of beatings only to be shot in the street like a dog, but she found she wasn't afraid. If these were her last moments, at least she'd known what it felt like to be cared for. At least she'd had 2 weeks of freedom, of feeling like a person instead of property. "I love you," she said to Xavier, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know I have no right to, but I do. And I'm grateful you came into my life, even if it was just for a little while." Xavier's eyes widened. "Jane," Robert cocked the hammer. "How touching. Say goodbye to your cowboy." Everything happened at once. Xavier dove forward. A shot rang out. Jane felt Robert's grip on her loosen, and she fell to the ground. For a horrible moment, she thought Xavier had been shot, but then she saw him standing over Robert, who was clutching his shoulder and groaning. Sheriff Thompson walked up, his own gun smoking. "Reckon that's enough of that," he said. "Robert Dalton, you're under arrest for assault, attempted murder, and being a general menace." 2 deputies hauled Robert away, still groaning about his shoulder. The sheriff had deliberately aimed to wound, not kill, but it was enough to end the threat. Xavier dropped to his knees beside Jane, his hands running over her, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay," Jane said, though she was shaking like a leaf. "Margaret, I'm fine," Margaret called from the doorway, holding a cloth to her bleeding lip. "Takes more than Robert Dalton to put me down." Xavier helped Jane to her feet, and then he was hugging her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, feeling his heart hammering against her chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair. "I thought I was too late. You weren't. You saved me. Again." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Did you mean what you said?" Jane knew what he was asking. She could take it back, could blame it on fear and adrenaline. But she was done lying, done hiding. "Yes, I meant it. I love you, Xavier Frost." His smile was like sunrise. "Thank God, because I love you too. Have since about the second day I knew you, and it's been driving me half crazy keeping it to myself." "I'm still married," Jane reminded him, even as her heart soared. "Not for long. Harper will expedite that divorce now that Robert's going to prison for attempted murder." Xavier touched her face gently, careful of her bruises. "And then, if you'll have me, I'd like to court you proper." "Do this right." "Court me," Jane laughed, slightly hysterical. "You've already fought for me, bled for me, turned your whole life upside down for me. I think we're past courting." "Maybe, but you deserve it anyway. Deserve flowers and poetry and someone taking you to church socials. All the things you should have had from the start." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Let me give you that." "Yes," Jane whispered. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a promise of better things to come. Around them, the street was full of people watching, but Jane didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next few months passed in a blur of legal proceedings and small-town gossip. Robert was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attempted murder and assault. Benjamin Harper worked his magic, and Jane's divorce was granted in record time, the judge citing extreme abuse and cruelty. Xavier stayed in Great Bend, taking a permanent job at the livery. He was good with horses, just like he'd said, and the owner was happy to have reliable help. He rented a small house on the edge of town and filled it with simple furniture he built himself. True to his word, he courted Jane properly. He brought her wildflowers picked from the prairie. He took her to church socials and town picnics. He read poetry with her on Margaret's porch and taught her to ride horses, something Robert had never allowed. Jane blossomed under the attention. The shadows left her eyes, and she smiled more easily. She got a job helping at the schoolhouse, assisting the elderly teacher with the younger children. It wasn't quite being a teacher herself, but it was close, and she loved it. On a cool October evening, 6 months after they'd met, Xavier took Jane to the creek outside town. The cottonwoods were turning gold, and the water reflected the orange sunset. He'd packed a picnic cold chicken and fresh bread and apple pie from the bakery. After they ate, he got down on one knee in the grass. "Jane Dalton," he said, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket, "I know we've already been through more than most couples face in a lifetime. I know we've done things backward and unconventional. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You're brave and kind and resilient, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how valuable you are. Will you marry me?" Jane was crying, but this time they were happy tears. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her, and it was different from their first kiss. This one was full of passion and promise, the kiss of two people who'd fought to be together and won. They were married a month later in the small church in Great Bend. Margaret stood up with Jane, and the livery owner stood up with Xavier. Benjamin Harper officiated, having gotten himself ordained for the occasion. Half the town turned out, people who'd ignored Jane's suffering for years but were happy enough to celebrate her joy now. Jane found she could forgive them. Holding grudges seemed pointless when she had so much happiness to embrace. She wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, and Xavier wore his best shirt and new trousers. He couldn't stop smiling, and when it came time to say his vows, his voice was thick with emotion. "I promise to fight for you every day for the rest of my life," he said. "I promise to make you feel safe and loved and valued. I promise to be the man you deserve." Jane's own vows were simpler. "I promise to love you with everything I am. You gave me my life back, and I want to spend it with you." When they kissed as husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. They walked out into the November sunshine, and Jane felt like she could float away. This was real. This was hers. This beautiful, honorable man who'd fought for her from the very first moment. They spent their wedding night in Xavier's house, which was now their house. He carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the front room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Frost," he said. "Mrs. Frost," Jane repeated, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." That night, Xavier was gentle and patient, erasing the bad memories Robert had left and replacing them with tenderness. He worshipped her body like it was something precious, and Jane felt cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, she said, "I never thought I could be this happy." "Get used to it," Xavier said, echoing the words he'd spoken that first day. "This is what the rest of our life looks like." And he was right. The years that followed were good ones. Xavier excelled at the livery, and eventually the owner retired and sold him the business. Jane became the full-time teacher when the old teacher passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was excellent at it, patient and creative, and the children adored her. They bought a small plot of land and built a bigger house, with a porch for reading on summer evenings and a fireplace for cold winter nights. They filled it with books and laughter and love. In the spring of 1879, Jane discovered she was pregnant. Xavier was beside himself with joy, fussing over her constantly until she had to remind him she was having a baby. not dying. He painted a nursery and built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it until there wasn't a single rough edge. Their son was born in December, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him James, after Jane's grandfather who'd been kind to her as a child. Xavier held his son with tears streaming down his face and promised to always protect him, to teach him to be strong but gentle, to show him how to treat people with respect. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a tiny thing with Xavier's green eyes and Jane's dark hair. They named her Rose because she was born in June, when Margaret's roses were in full bloom. Xavier was just as tender with Rose as he was with James, proving that his capacity for love was boundless. Robert Dalton was released from prison in 1881, and there was some tension in town when word got out. But he didn't come near Jane or Xavier. He left Great Bend and was never heard from again. Jane didn't spend energy thinking about him. Her life was too full of good things to waste time on the past. The years rolled on. James grew into a serious boy who loved books like his mother and had a gift for working with his hands like his father. Rose was spirited and adventurous, always climbing trees and bringing home stray animals. Xavier taught them both to ride and to be kind, and Jane taught them to read and to question the world around them. In 1885, Margaret passed away in her sleep at the age of 62. The funeral was well attended, and Jane spoke about how Margaret had given her refuge when she had nowhere else to go. She was brave when others were silent, Jane said, and I'll never forget that. They named their third child, another daughter born in 1886, Margaret in her honor. Little Margaret was quiet and observant, with an old soul that reminded Xavier of his mother. Xavier and Jane grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had their challenges years when the crops failed, when illness swept through town, when money was tight. But they faced everything together, never forgetting how they'd started. On their 20th anniversary, Xavier took Jane back to the creek where he'd proposed. They were older now, with lines on their faces and silver threading through their hair, but the love between them was as strong as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Jane asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Giving up your plans for me, not even for a second," Xavier said without hesitation. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Those weren't plans I gave up, they were just ideas. You're real. This life we've built is real. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." "I love you," Jane said. "More now than even that first day, if that's possible." "It's possible. I feel the same way." He kissed her temple. "You know what the best part is?" "What?" "We still have years ahead of us. Years to watch our children grow, to maybe meet grandchildren someday. Years to sit on that porch and read poetry. Years to love each other." He squeezed her hand. "I can't wait." Jane smiled and squeezed back. She thought about that girl who'd stumbled into a saloon with her face beaten and her spirit nearly broken. She'd never imagined a future beyond surviving. She'd never dreamed someone would fight for her, would see her as worth protecting and cherishing. But Xavier had. From the very first moment, he'd chosen her. He'd changed his life for her. He'd loved her through the hard parts and celebrated her through the good parts. He'd given her a home, a family, a life worth living. In 1892, their son James married a sweet girl named Elizabeth. The wedding was beautiful, and Jane cried happy tears watching her boy become a man. A year later, Elizabeth gave birth to a grandson they named Xavier, and when the old Xavier held his tiny namesake, Jane saw tears in her husband's eyes. "We made all this," he said softly, gesturing to the gathered family, their 3 children, their son-in-law, their grandson. "You and me. We made this whole beautiful thing." "We did," Jane agreed, her heart full to bursting. Rose married in 1895 to a farmer's son who worshipped the ground she walked on. Their daughter Margaret showed no interest in marriage, preferring her books and her work as a nurse, and Jane and Xavier supported her completely. Times were changing, and women had more choices now. Jane was glad for it. In 1900, Xavier and Jane celebrated their 25th anniversary. Their children threw them a party and the whole town turned out. There were speeches and dancing and a cake 3 layers tall. When it came time for toasts, James stood up. "My parents have shown me what real love looks like," he said. "Not the easy kind that appears in dime novels, but the kind that fights through difficulty and comes out stronger. My father literally fought for my mother before they even knew each other. And every day since, he's kept fighting for her in small ways, making her coffee, fixing things around the house, listening when she talks. And my mother fought too, to heal from her past, to build a new life, to love without fear. They taught me that love is a choice you make every day, and I'm grateful for that lesson." Xavier and Jane held hands and smiled at each other. It was all true. They had fought for this, for each other, for their family, for their happiness. And they'd won. As the years continued, they slowed down physically, but remained sharp in mind and spirit. Xavier retired from the livery, selling it to a young man who reminded him of himself at that age. Jane retired from teaching, though she still tutored children in the afternoons. They spent their time with grandchildren 4 by 1905 and with each other. They'd sit on their porch in the evenings, just like they'd done when they were courting, and watch the sun set over the Kansas prairie. Sometimes they'd read aloud to each other. Sometimes they'd just hold hands in comfortable silence. "You remember that first day?" Jane asked one summer evening in 1906. "When I walked into that saloon?" "Every detail," Xavier said. "You were wearing a blue dress. The blood on your lip was still fresh. Your left eye was swollen shut. And I remember thinking that someone needed to do something, and it might as well be me." "Best decision you ever made?" Jane asked teasingly. "Best decision I ever made," Xavier confirmed. "Well, that and asking you to marry me, and having children with you, and building this house." "And I get it," Jane laughed. "Best decisions, plural." "All decisions that involved you," Xavier said. "You're my best decision, Jane, every day." She leaned over and kissed him, and it was sweet and familiar, the kiss of 2 people who'd spent a lifetime learning each other. In 1910, their 50th wedding anniversary approached. Their children wanted to throw another party, but Xavier and Jane requested something quieter. Just family, they said. Just the people who mattered most. So on a November afternoon, with snow threatening in the gray sky, their children and grandchildren gathered in the house Xavier had built. There were 8 grandchildren now, ranging from 17-year-old Xavier to baby Catherine, just 6 months old. The house was full of noise and warmth and love. After dinner, Xavier stood to make a speech. He was 74 now, his hair completely white, his body not as strong as it once was. But his eyes were still that startling green, and when he looked at Jane, he still saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 34 years ago. 50 years, he said. That's a long time. Long enough to forget the bad and remember only the good, except I don't need to forget anything because it's all been good. Every year, every day with this woman has been a gift. He looked at Jane. You made me a better man. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up grateful every morning. I fought for you once, in a saloon in Great Bend when we were both young and the world seemed harder than it does now. But you fought for me too. You fought to trust me, to love me, to build this life with me. And I want all these children and grandchildren to know that this is what love looks like. It's not always dramatic. Most days it's quiet and simple, but it's real and it's worth fighting for. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Jane stood and wrapped her arms around her husband, and their family applauded. That night, lying in bed, Jane said, "I can't imagine what my life would have been like if you hadn't walked into that saloon that day." "Probably pretty terrible," Xavier said honestly. "Robert would have killed you eventually. I know, and I'd have died thinking I deserved it, that I'd somehow failed as a person." She turned to face him in the darkness. "But you showed me I had value. You fought for me when no one else would. And you kept fighting not with fists, but with love and patience and faith in me. You saved my life in more ways than one, Xavier Frost." "You saved mine too," Xavier said. "I was just drifting before I met you, going from job to job, town to town, no real purpose. You gave me a reason to stay, to build something lasting. We saved each other." "I like that," Jane whispered. "We saved each other." They fell asleep holding hands the way they had for 50 years. Xavier lived to be 81, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1917 with Jane beside him. The whole town mourned. He'd been a fixture in Great Bend for 41 years, known for his kindness, his integrity, and his absolute devotion to his wife. At his funeral, dozens of people stood up to speak about how he'd helped them a job when they were desperate, a loan when times were hard, advice when they were struggling. He'd spent his life fighting for people, just like he'd fought for Jane that first day. Jane lived another 5 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. She spent her time writing down the story of how she and Xavier met, wanting future generations to know what real love looked like. She wrote about the saloon, about Xavier fighting Robert, about those early days of courting and the decades that followed. On her deathbed at 87, with her family gathered around, Jane's last words were, "Tell him I'm coming. Tell Xavier I'm on my way and I can't wait to see him again." She died with a smile on her face. They were buried side by side in the Great Bend Cemetery, their graves marked with simple headstones. On Jane's stone, her children had inscribed, "She was worth fighting for." On Xavier's, "He never stopped fighting for her." Their children inherited the house and the land, and it stayed in the family for generations. The story of Xavier and Jane became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. Some details probably got exaggerated over the years, but the core truth remained. A cowboy had seen a woman in need and chosen to fight for her, and that choice had changed both their lives forever. In the small museum that Great Bend eventually established, there's a display about the town's history. Among the photographs and artifacts is a worn copy of Walt Whitman's poems and a simple gold wedding band. The placard explains that these belonged to Jane and Xavier Frost, a local couple whose love story became legendary. Tourists sometimes stop to read the brief summary of their lives, and occasionally someone will comment on how romantic it all sounds. But it wasn't just romance. It was two broken people choosing to heal together. It was a man deciding that doing the right thing mattered more than convenience. It was a woman learning that she deserved love and respect. It was 50 years of small daily choices to honor the commitment they'd made to each other. It was a cowboy who said, "Get used to it," when he promised to fight for a woman he'd just met, and then spent the rest of his life keeping that promise. And it was a woman who'd never had anyone fight for her before, finally getting used to being cherished, protected, and loved. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Kansas, and they know the story by heart. They know about the saloon and the fight and the 50-year marriage that followed. And when they're old enough to understand, their parents sit them down and explain what the story really means. That love is worth fighting for, that people can change their circumstances, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the most important moment of your life is when you choose to stand up for someone else. Xavier and Jane's story isn't just about romance, though there was plenty of that. It's about dignity and choice and the radical act of believing someone deserves better. It's about how one moment of courage, Xavier choosing to intervene when everyone else looked away, can ripple through time, creating family and love and hope where none existed before. In the end, that's what made their story worth telling. Not the dramatic fight or the dangerous confrontation, but the quiet persistence of their love. The way Xavier fought for Jane not just that first day in the saloon, but every day after in 1,000 small ways. The way Jane fought, too, against her trauma and fear, to open her heart and trust again. The way they built a life together that honored both their strength and their vulnerability. They proved that sometimes the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing each other and doing the hard work of building something beautiful. They proved that it's never too late to stand up for someone, to change your life, to fight for what's right. And in a small town in Kansas, their legacy lives on in the descendants who carry their names and their values, in the house that still stands on the edge of town, in the stories passed down through generations. Jane and Xavier Frost loved each other well, and that love created ripples that spread far beyond their own lives. That's what happens when someone finally fights for you, and you get used to it. It changes everything.